It's UofL Today on 93.9 The Phil. Here's your host, Mark Hebert.
And welcome to UofL Today. We are so glad you're along for the ride. For the next half hour, we've got a couple of interesting topics to talk about. And if you've got a bad boss, we'll be talking about that person here in just a couple of minutes. So we're glad to have you 93.9 listeners along with us, as well as you viewers on Metro TV, the City of Louisville's government access channel. So today's topics, here's what we're going to talk about. Bad bosses and bad cemetery operators. Not necessarily the same people. Later in the show, we'll be talking to Phil DiBlasi, who's a UofL anthropologist who was appointed to oversee the cleanup of the mess at Eastern Cemetery years ago when the owners double buried bodies in the same gravesite, left urns and grave sites unmarked, and just created a mess and a tough time for the families who had loved ones that were supposed to be buried at Eastern Cemetery. Well, now he's got the remains of dozens of people sitting on shelves in his office, and he's trying to find their loved ones. And so we'll talk to him. I think you'll find that interesting.
Wow.
But first, if you haven't had a bad boss, you are a very lucky person. Most of us have had at least one bad boss in our lifetime that may have used intimidation and fear along with other dysfunctional attributes to, in their mind, keep employees in their place. 3 UofL professors have studied and written about those dysfunctional leaders. They are Brad Shuck, Kevin Rose, and Matt Bergman. They're with the College of Education and Human Development in the Organizational Leadership and Learning Department. So they're here to talk about it. That's a really long title. You know that? The College of Education, Human Development, and blah, 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 blah.
How about that?
All right. So you're in the College of Education.
Yep.
Welcome aboard, all you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So tell me about the study. Who wants to start? And just tell me about the study that you guys did.
Yeah,
so this is Brad, by the way.
I can kick it off. We were kind of standing around in the copy room one day and kind of thinking about kind of our past history with work and thinking about bosses we had had and leaders we had had, and we thought, how do those people actually affect not only your work but also your health? So the idea was that when you work for a really bad boss, that over time you end up taking some of this stuff back home and you unpack it at home. So it affects things like your health, your healthy habits, going to the gym, how much you might drink, your sleeping habits.
And how much you might drink.
Yeah.
And how much you might drink.
And that as well, absolutely, which may affect your health in some way, right?
Right.
And how you treat your wife or your partner.
That's exactly right. So we thought there were some pretty important things that we might learn from this. Normally, our research is really focused toward the positive. We think about things like organizational citizenship behavior, which is Kevin's focus of research, or persistence, which is Matt's focus of research, or things like employee engagement. So this is kind of a deviation from what we normally study on a day-to-day basis.
All right, so the 3 of you got together and said, hey, let's study bad bosses. That's how it all kind of came to fruition. So when did you do this study, and how did you do it?
So this study is kind of unfolded in a couple of different ways.
This is Kevin, by the way.
Yes, this is Kevin. So we started off looking conceptually at the literature and saying, what can previous research tell us already about bad bosses, about abusive supervision, about dysfunctional bosses, all the kind of different things that people struggle with on a day-to-day basis with their leadership. So we started with that. That kind of was the springboard for us. And most recently, we have actually collected some data around bad bosses using a sample here in the community, actually around the nation, around the world, actually. It's an international sample of folks who are dealing with bad bosses. So now we have some data that can help us to flesh this out a little bit more and look at some of these empirical results to start looking at what do bad bosses do to people.
And Matt, when you started putting that together, what did you find?
Well, when we first thought of this, we thought, what is the difference between the people that we see in Hollywood on horrible bosses 1,
like in the movies?
Yeah, like in the movies, and the difference between that and like The Office, right? So Michael Scott was a more dysfunctional leader than a horrible boss. So we wanted to understand the distinction there and how that really impacted people and where they unpack that at home. So what we found is the idea around these idea that we have some erosion of emotional energy. So how does that directly then erode the ability to produce high quality work?
Yeah. Have you ever, you have a really bad day at work, right? And your boss is kind of on your case about something, or they take your idea, or they yell at you in a meeting, or something kind of happens, and you go home and you're tired. Now, the first day that happens, you kind of have an emotional reserve that you can use that kind of makes up for that. But over time, you're tired when you go, and you can't explain that. You may sleep a lot, or you can't come up with new ideas, or you don't want to come up with new ideas because the energy that you've got emotionally, it just gets eroded to where you have this exhaustion that is really hard to explain to people because you're not sure where it's coming from.
Right, and it starts to chip away. So this is a cumulative effect and not just a one single instance. And that's what we find with dysfunction is that it happens over time rather than an abusive boss that would yell in your face and take it to such a heightened level. This is chipping away or eroding at your emotional energy to really impact the direct quality of your work.
All right, we're talking with Matt Bergman, Kevin Rose, and Brad Shuck about their research, I guess it was a research project into everybody was using the common term horrible bosses. What did you call it? What was the official title, in research terms, the big fancy words? What'd you call it?
That's actually a good question. And we distinguish this as dysfunctional leadership. So as Matt was saying, it's not necessarily the kinds of leaders who come out and maybe physically abuse someone, right? That there is a kind of leadership that speaks to those kinds of leaders. So we coin this as dysfunctional leadership. The kind of leadership that, as we've discussed, erodes at that emotional energy on you from day to day. It's a slow process, and sometimes those kinds of things can stick with you over time.
It's a wearing down, and we distinguish the idea of horrible bosses versus dysfunctional by dysfunctional bosses are often blissfully unaware of their dysfunction. It's not that they set out to be dysfunctional. They just are making habits that get in the way of productivity.
And oftentimes use the actual policies that are instated by whatever organization to leverage their agendas in a way that is dysfunctional.
Which makes them incredibly difficult to spot in an organization. So let's give you an example. So, for example, performance reviews are something that you're going to find in every organization across the city, across the state, across the country, right? But performance evaluations are oftentimes used dysfunctionally. So a boss might take that opportunity to really harp on you about the things that you do really badly, right? Despite the fact that you've had an amazing year or you've been very productive. A dysfunctional leader, we call that verbally shivving someone, where the boss will quickly take a quick jab at you and then walk away and go, no, wait. We were talking about performance here. But really what their intention is to get at you emotionally. And here's the thing about it. They believe themselves to be developmental in doing that. So in pointing out weaknesses and harping on those kinds of things and verbally shivving you, they think they're helping you get better. They're blissfully unaware of their dysfunction.
All right, I'll tell you what, we're going to take a break real quick. We're going to come back with more about horrible bosses and dysfunctional leaders with three gentlemen from the College of Education and Human Development. When we return, this is UofL Today with Mark Hebert on 93.9 The Ville.
My name's Natalie. I'm a junior studying communications at the University of Louisville. UofL has given me mentorship opportunities. I'm in the honors program. I've had a lot of opportunities through that. I got involved in Greek life. I'm a Cardinal ambassador, so I get to show people what I love about our university. And then I'm also on the student orientation staff, so I get to work with the incoming freshmen and calm any of their nerves about college and just show them my passion for UofL and hopefully transfer that to them. Family is really what it's all about here at UofL. Go Cards!
Welcome back to UofL Today with Mark Hebert. We are talking to three gentlemen from the College of Education and Human Development, Brad Shuck, Kevin Rose, and Matt Bergman. We're talking about their research on horrible bosses, which they want to make clear is more about dysfunctional leaders. So let's talk about that. How many people out there, what percentage of employees have what you would term either dysfunctional leaders or horrible bosses? They're all looking at each other like, who's going to answer that question? So one of you, go ahead.
It's probably fair to say almost everybody.
100%.
100%.
By the way, the guy in the studio, Brad Knoop, who's one of my employees, is shaking his head back
Of course,
there.
of course he is. Right.
Yeah.
Literature shows that, and research shows that upwards of about a third of people deal with really bad bosses on a day-to-day basis. So that's a roundabout number, but I think at any given time we have each individually dealt with a bad boss, either in the past, currently, or you'll deal with one in the future. So I think it's fair to say that employees need to be equipped to understand dysfunctional bosses, to deal with dysfunctional bosses at any given time. So I think it's something that we as a nation we share in common. That's something that we share.
Well, didn't your study say, I read the synopsis of your study, which said that up to a third, basically, of employees have someone that has a boss that really impacts their ability to perform in their job. Is that a fair assessment?
That's right.
Okay. So what are the things we're talking about? If I've got a dysfunctional boss, what happens to me? I mean, how does it affect me?
Well, we think it happens a couple of ways. We think it affects you professionally in that you do less work. You're less creative. You're less likely to raise your hand in meetings. And here's the interesting thing about raising a hand in a meeting or being creative. Nobody knows you're not doing it. So how many listeners out there, or how many people here can think of a time when they've been in a meeting, they've been asked a question, they know the answer to the question, and they didn't raise their hand? No one in the room knew that you knew the answer to that question, but you withheld something, right? And that's this idea of disengagement. So people who work for dysfunctional leaders, they just disengage because sometimes it's the most psychologically safe thing they can do. They physically push themselves away from the table and they emotionally distance themselves from that person because it's the safest thing they can possibly do.
And that fear translates over into their work, their productivity, and then they take that home and they unpack that. So if you're having a rough time at work, you sometimes lash out at home. Yeah. So it really takes apart the fabric of the family potentially, and then it impacts your health. So like we said, do you drink more? Do you engage in poor healthy eating decisions?
Yeah.
Do you drink more soda? Do you eat more food? All of these things can be a repercussion or a result of that fear that then plays out in so many aspects of your life.
One of the most interesting findings, I think, from our most current research is that when people have dysfunctional bosses, they will tend to engage in what we call counterproductive work behaviors. So they will, in some sense, lash out at work, right? It might be something like we said, like disengagement, right? You're not going to raise your hand. But it could also be things like, I'm going to steal paper clips, right? Or small things like that.
The way to get back at the boss?
Exactly. That's exactly right. That's
in
exactly
your own
right.
mind?
That's exactly right.
Well, that's just weird.
No one has ever done that, right? One of the most fascinating things, though, is that even with a boss who's not considered highly dysfunctional, someone who's considered maybe more neutral, a neutral boss, that doesn't mean you're going to do good behaviors. It simply means you're not going to do bad behaviors. So it's an interesting sort of mix of how I perceive my boss and then how I'm going to relate to my organization and how I'm going to behave at work.
Is there any difference between having a bad boss or a boss that's not a good manager and then having being part of an organization that is dysfunctional? I mean, I think there's a lot of companies that have dysfunctional management, dysfunctional leadership, but I may have a great boss. Yeah. So does that make any difference to the employees or to the organization?
Yeah, we think so, in that I think our opinion might be, and I don't speak for the group here, but employees will define their experience of work based on the relationship they have with their most immediate supervisor, whoever that person is. And so sometimes you can be in a really tough organization, but have a really amazing boss, someone who you know cares about you, who's looking out for you. You've got their back, they've got your back, and you guys are working together to make positive change in that organization. Yeah, most definitely, there's a huge difference between that.
One of the things that happens, I think, with bosses is that they can, as we describe in some of our research, they can use organizational policy against you. And on the flip side of that, good bosses can perhaps look at the organizational policy and be flexible, and they can work with
Find
you.
ways to make it work.
Exactly. And
Right.
so you'll have a good experience, even if the organization might itself be dysfunctional. They can sort of help frame that for you and provide a lens through which to view that.
And a unique thing that happens oftentimes, if it's an overall dysfunctional organization, but a high-functioning team, is you almost have this common enemy or this common driving force to do great work against the odds, in spite of, to try and produce with this really local unit, this local team that you have to really develop the overall organization.
Kind of like athletic teams that have a coach that they really don't like, and he's the common enemy, and they play well.
That's right.
All right.
Yep, exactly.
All right, well, let's kind of wrap this up. I'm just going to ask you, the three of you. So I'm an employee. I've got a dysfunctional boss or a horrible boss, either one. What do I do? What would you recommend to folks out there who are listening going, yeah, I've got that man or woman for a boss? Go ahead, one of you.
I think one of the things that I'll mention is that you have to know which battles to take on. Some battles are not worth taking on, and some are. And so I think you have to know that. You have to be aware of yourself. So self-awareness is a big issue here, and knowing where do I take a stand and where do I not? I think that's going to be important for folks.
The other thing I'd add to that is in choosing which battles to take on is to know your personal triggers. Everybody's going to be triggered by something different. You need to know yours, and you need to learn from those experiences when they happen. And then the onus becomes on you to be able to manage some of that. So if a certain situation really gets you upset, you need to know that. First time it happens, the first time you explode, take that information, learn from it, move on to the next time. But you need to know your own personal triggers.
All right, wait a minute. Before you go, Matt, are you telling me deal with it, don't go to HR? Or are you telling me go to HR?
Oh, I would go to HR. I mean, I think that's part of, you need to follow the procedure that's laid out within the organization. I would absolutely go to HR.
That's pretty tough.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
It is tough. And we would note that some people won't do that, because once you go to HR, you put that, what's distinguishing between a dysfunctional leader is it's the relationship between you and the employee or you and the leader. And that creates a sense of social isolation. And so sometimes people won't say those things because there's a fear of being outed from that. There's repercussion from that. And we've heard countless stories from people who've experienced backlash because they've spoken up. No question about it.
And again, I think you have to know which battles are worth taking, right?
Right.
If your boss says, I don't like the color of your shirt, that's not worthy of going to HR, right? But you deal with it and you move on.
All right, Matt, final word.
So you're building that support network, the people that you work directly with, if you can find a way to work in ways that support and provide compassion and empathy for one another, you oftentimes can rise above and you can reflect through and deal with some of that dysfunction.
All right. Guys, appreciate it. Matt Bergman, Kevin Rose, Brad Shuck from the University of Louisville's College of Education and Human Development, the organizational leadership and learning. I got it all out.
Nice.
There you go.
Pleasure.
Appreciate
Thank
you
you
being
for
here.
having
us.
Thank you so much.
All right. When we come back from the break, Phil DiBlasi has the remains of people in his UofL workspace. What's he doing with them? Well, we'll talk about that when we come back. UofL Today with Mark Hebert on 93.9 The Ville.
This is our time to soar. We are an unstoppable force of innovation and academic excellence, solving the world's mysteries through research, stimulating growth in our community and beyond, and inspiring the next generation of leaders to build a better future for all of us. We are the University of Louisville. Watch us take flight.
Welcome back to UofL Today with Mark Hebert on 93.9 The Ville and on Metro TV. Welcome to those of you who are watching on Metro TV. Phil DiBlasi teaches anthropology classes at the University of Louisville, but he is probably best known for his work on the infamous Eastern Cemetery case, where dozens, perhaps hundreds of bodies were double buried in grave sites, and that was discovered in the late 1980s. And DiBlasi has been involved ever since. Is that a fair assessment of you, Phil?
I call it the cemetery from hell. Yes,
The cemetery from
it keeps coming back and getting me. I mean, literally every day, I'm involved with that cemetery. People looking for parents, people looking for grandparents. These genealogists are the worst.
All right. Well, let's back up a little bit.
Okay.
So how did the whole Eastern Cemetery case come about, and then how did you get involved?
Okay,
I know it's a long story, but give me the Reader's Digest.
The Reader's
version.
Digest version is that I do anthropology, I do archaeology, I do bioanthropology. So these are skill sets that I've been using with the Attorney General's office, and I had been involved with the investigation of a number of cemeteries prior to Eastern. In June or July of 1989, one of the grave diggers apparently felt compelled to make an anonymous call to the Attorney General's office. So what happened was they got involved with an investigation. They called me in as part of that investigation, and I've been involved with that project ever since.
And so what did the gravedigger report to the AG, and what did the Attorney General find?
Well,
And what did you find?
okay. Actually, your numbers were a little incorrect. I almost leapt in at the beginning. He reported that they were using graves more than once. And it was so obvious that this was going on that the gravedigger said, hey, we're doing something wrong here. So the operators of the cemetery wrote a policy, which is kind of a bad thing to do, and said if you find previously buried people, with respect, move them out of the way, and we'll make money by burying more people. So they reported it's come out now, the fellow that did this, one of the gravediggers who did the reporting, and it became public knowledge. And literally the numbers that we have right now, and they keep growing, 130,000 plus or minus individuals buried where there's room for 30,000 people buried.
Let's say that again. Say that again.
I know.
That's stunning.
There are more than 100,000 people buried in that cemetery than there are room for. And then an additional...
So just get this correct. So there were 30,000 grave sites, basically. Room for 30,000 grave sites at Eastern Cemetery. There's 130,000 people buried there. So that's 4 people, basically, in every grave site.
Yeah, the problem is that some of the area, because it's kind of mildly karst, there's sinkholes there, were not prime areas for burial. So those are only buried once. Other areas are buried 7 times. One section, in fact, one of the things that I do in my spare time is I enter data into the databases so that we can find this information for people. And I obviously this was done before computers. So what I did was I entered it. The records are chronological by day, like a journal. And then what I do is I say, okay, organize it by the section of the cemetery, the row, and the grave number. And suddenly I find that there are 4 people buried in that grave or 5 people buried in that grave. And they didn't even wait until the bodies cooled. I mean, there were people that were buried a month later in the same grave. And then 20 years later, and then, it just goes on and on and on. It's horrible.
All right, we'll get to what's going on right now, what you're trying to do and who you're trying to find here in a minute. But just to back up a little bit, why did the Attorney General's office come to a University of Louisville anthropology professor to do this? Why you? What was...
Okay, that story started in Louisville Cemetery on Goss Avenue. There was a criminal investigation of their activities, their burying activities. David Wolf, who was a state medical examiner, physical anthropologist at the time, and I were buds because we're colleagues. And he didn't have the time. It wasn't a homicide that really needed his skill sets. It was over burial and identifying human remains, which were my skill sets. So he got me involved with that. It was an AG issue, and then the Attorney General's office basically used me.
So because you had some prior experience
right,
and they knew
right.
what was going on. Okay, we're talking with Phil DiBlasi, who's an anthropology professor and archaeology professor at the University of Louisville, but he's also involved in these cemetery issues around Louisville. We're specifically talking about Eastern Cemetery. So after you find all these burials that are double buried, triple buried, quadruple buried,
right?
I suspect did you find some urns as well with
the
folks
cremations? Again, that was another series of charges. They were charged with cremating multiple bodies at the same time, I guess to save fuel. They were. That's terrible.
Well,
I'm sorry.
I mean, it is a little.
Well, it's wrong.
It's
obviously.
wrong. It's wrong. But if you can't laugh about this kind of stuff, you shouldn't be.
You shouldn't be in the business.
That's right. You shouldn't be in the business.
So, and there are 2 issues here. One is called complete cremains. We have 2 different sets of cremains, and I actually have the numbers. We have 296 sets of complete cremains. This is when you have an individual cremated, you never want to see the ashes again, they're disposed of, okay? These were taken in evidence by the Attorney General's office, and after the case was ultimately resolved, very badly, by the way, they brought them to us for curation. And then the columbarium, which is where you have, grandma in a really pretty urn and you have her behind glass. And, well, because the cemetery, the owners left it, that was being vandalized for the bronze. And they were literally pouring ashes out. One very sad story is a woman whose husband had been killed in the 9/11 towers, went looking for her mom and said she was cremated, and we have a presence on the web because of the UofL website. She found me, and I went to find Mom's ashes. And it turned out Mom's ashes had been poured out, and the bronze urn, had been taken to a scrapyard.
Oh, geez.
So my job was to get on my hands and knees and scrape up Mom's ashes and put her in a Ziploc bag so that the woman could have closure.
Right.
So we had 368 sets of columbarium cremains in urns.
So now you have, I teased this to you coming on the show as the guy who's got a bunch of cremains sitting on shelves in your office, which is true. So how many sets of cremains and ashes, etc., do you have sitting on shelves over in your big office at UofL, and what are you trying to do with them?
Well, we're trying to get them back to family members. The problem is this was the first crematorium in the state of Kentucky. So we have individuals that were cremated in the 1940s. Their families have moved; they're gone.
You can't find them.
No, well, I'm working on it. I mean, since
tough to find them.
1995, I've been getting online and looking. People with unusual names. The Joneses are the worst.
How about the Smiths?
Yeah. You can never find them because there's just so many of them. But the Pollocks and the unusual, the Slavic names and Italian names and things like that, they're kind of easy to find, and we found individuals like that. Again, because we have a presence on the web, I've been putting these lists up, and this group called Missing in America, who are trying to find individuals who have been cremated and are in storage and just all over the place. They've claimed about 50 or 60, somewhere in that number. So I'm very pleased because they have come out of our collections. They've been handled by a funeral home. I can't remember which one. And then they ultimately end up in the Veteran Cemetery. They have a columbarium down there in Lebanon, Kentucky.
Okay. So there have been some folks, you've had this organization that's found some of them and contacted you and come and gotten the cremains and taken them to the cemetery, right?
Yes.
Okay.
To another cemetery.
Another cemetery, yes. Right, not Eastern Cemetery. But you've still got how many sitting on shelves that either you may have a name of the person that's in the
birth
urn
and death
or whatever.
dates, yes.
Oh, so you've got a lot of information
Yeah.
on these folks. You just can't find the loved one to go repair,
Exactly.
or you're looking for the loved one.
Exactly. And this is kind of a sad story. When they came to our facility by court order, I called the Courier-Journal and I said, would you all give us a free legal ad in, the little teensy print back in the want ads or whatever. And the fellow on the phone says, how many words do you have? And I gave him the words, and he basically quoted me a price of over $5,000. And I said, you people have made $1 million selling papers about this story. You think you could cut us a break? And he goes like, no. It's like, okay, fine.
Well, so how are you now getting a hold of people, or trying to give people access that they can get a hold of you?
Martha Ellison, who writes for the neighborhood section in the CJ, I called her. She's done stories on the research that I've done and stuff like that. So she wrote an article that went in the front of the neighborhood section. It was back in '96. And it was like, if you have relatives that are cremated and their ashes are at Eastern, you think, call this number and we'll do the research for you. We'll let you know. And then you come and swear out an affidavit and we'll give you whomever. This is a kind of a funny story. I was... you take students and you show them the lab, and this is what we do, and try to get them involved in addition to the classwork. And this one young lady says, I think my grandma and grandpa were cremated there. So she called her mom and dad and found out that, yes, indeed, and she filled out the certificate of being part of the nearest next of kin, and she went home from class that day with her grandma and her grandpa.
There you go. All right, we got about 30 seconds left. So what would you tell folks? How do they track you down, or where should they look if they think grandma or grandpa might have been buried at Eastern Cemetery and is now sitting on your desk?
Well, the easiest way is to find me on the web, send me an email, send me the information, their names and their death dates if you have it, or give me a call at the program of archaeology. Can I give the number?
Absolutely.
852-6724. Give me a call, leave a message. I'll get back with you, and we'll find out if they're there. We have you fill out an affidavit. That's all it takes, and then we don't deliver. You have to come and get them.
Very good. All right, Phil DiBlasi from UofL Anthropology Department. Appreciate it. All right, you can find all the podcasts of these programs on SoundCloud.com/UofL. This program is being broadcast on Metro TV beginning the week of November 30th. So thanks for joining us. You've been listening to UofL Today with Mark Hebert, and go Cards.